The horse's reins landed in Henrietta Kendrick's trembling hands before she even understood what was happening. "Take it," Jedediah Redmond said, his voice low and absolute, carved from the same hard stone as the canyon walls surrounding them. "You need to get home safely." She stared at him. The setting sun had turned the Arizona sky the color of a fresh wound, bleeding orange and deep crimson across the jagged silhouette of the Superstition Mountains. Dust still hung in the air from the ambush that had nearly killed them both not 20 minutes ago. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth, and here this man, this stranger, this drifter she had known for exactly 4 days was pressing the reins of his only horse into her hands and stepping back. "Jedediah," his name came out wrong, fractured. "This is your horse. This is the only horse you have. There are men out there who want both of us dead." He pulled his battered hat down lower over his forehead, shadowing those dark, unreadable eyes. A muscle worked in his jaw. His hands, she noticed, because she had been noticing his hands ever since she met him, were perfectly still at his sides, not reaching for the revolver at his hip, not reaching for her, just still. "I know exactly what I have," he said, "and I know exactly what I'm doing. Go." "I will not just go," she said, and something fierce surged up through her chest, burning away the fear and the exhaustion and the days of secrets between them. "Not without knowing why. Not without you telling me the truth about who you really are and what you're really running from. Because I know now, Jedediah. I know what that bounty poster in the saloon meant. I know about the dark past you have been hiding since the moment we met. And I am not leaving you here alone in the dark to face it." The stillness in him cracked just barely, just at the edges, and for one unguarded second she saw something raw and desperate move across his face like a storm crossing open country. Then it was gone. "Then I guess," he said quietly, "you need to know the whole story." The horse shifted under her grip, blowing hot breath into the cooling desert air, and above them the stars were beginning to appear one by one, like witnesses gathering for a reckoning. Henrietta Kendrick held onto the reins and held onto her courage and waited for the rugged, impossible, infuriating man before her to finally tell her the truth. 4 days earlier, it had been nothing but an ordinary disaster. Henrietta had been on the stage line from Tucson heading northeast toward the small ranching town of Caldwell Creek, where her brother Thomas ran a modest cattle operation with his wife Ruth. She had been traveling since dawn from the Tucson train station, having made the long journey west from St. Louis, because Thomas's last letter had carried a note of desperation in it that she could not ignore. Bad debts. A drought that had gripped the territory for 2 hard years. A business proposition that smelled wrong even through the paper and ink. She needed to see him with her own eyes. The stage had been carrying 4 passengers. Henrietta, a traveling dry goods salesman named Orville Chestnut who smelled of camphor and talked without stopping, a silent older Mexican rancher named Don Alejandro Vega, and a heavy-set man in a good suit who introduced himself as Mr. Franklin Daw and said he was in the land acquisition business. Henrietta had not liked Franklin Daw from the first moment she looked at him. His eyes were too busy, cataloging everything and everyone, and his smile never once reached those busy eyes. They were 3 hours out of Tucson and passing through a narrow stretch of dry creek bed when the stage lurched violently and came to a grinding, shuddering halt. The driver's voice came down in a curse then. "Axle's gone, everybody out." In 1882 in the Arizona Territory, a broken stage axle in open country was not a minor inconvenience. It was a legitimate crisis. The nearest settlement was a trading post called Mesquite Wells, roughly 9 miles to the northeast along a trail that twisted through territory the Apache had only recently stopped contesting. The driver, a weathered man named Pete, made it clear that he could not leave the stage unguarded, because the freight compartment contained a strongbox belonging to the Caldwell Creek Land and Trust Company. Franklin Daw, upon hearing this information, had become suddenly very interested in that strongbox. Henrietta noticed. Don Alejandro Vega noticed too, by the quiet way his eyes moved from Daw to the freight compartment and back. Orville Chestnut announced immediately that he had a bad knee and could not walk 9 miles in desert heat, and intended to wait with Pete for rescue. Don Alejandro said calmly that he knew this country and would make better time on foot alone, and set off with a quiet farewell. That left Henrietta and Franklin Daw standing beside the ruined stage in the late morning heat, staring at 9 miles of open desert. She had been 2 miles along the trail, walking at a measured pace, her traveling bag in one hand and a small parasol doing very little against the savage Arizona sun, when she heard the hoofbeats. She turned. The rider came out of a draw to the east, and her first thought was that he was part of the landscape, so thoroughly did he seem to belong to it. He was tall in the saddle, wearing a long dust-colored coat over a dark shirt, a rifle in the saddle's scabbard, a revolver on his hip, and a hat that had clearly seen years of hard use. The horse was a deep-chested bay mare who moved with the efficient economy of a well-traveled animal. He pulled up when he saw her and looked at her with those dark eyes, not threatening, not predatory, just intensely assessing in the way of someone who had learned that survival in open country depended on reading situations correctly and quickly. "Stage broke down?" he asked. His voice was low and unhurried, like a river running over smooth rock. "The axle," she confirmed, matching his directness. She was not and had never been the kind of woman who pretended helplessness. "I am walking to Mesquite Wells." He looked at the trail ahead, looked at the sky, looked at her sensible boots and her entirely impractical traveling dress. His expression was unreadable. "Hot," he said. "I am aware." 9 miles. I have counted. The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile but not quite. He stepped down from the horse in one fluid motion and said, "I'll walk with you a while." She had not asked him to. She had not agreed that this was a good idea. But she found, without quite meaning to, that she was walking beside him while his horse trailed along behind them on a loose rein, and the man, he told her his name was Jedediah Redmond, offered it simply like a man giving a gift he's not sure will be accepted, turned out to be the kind of person who could be quiet without making silence uncomfortable. They walked for an hour before he spoke again. "You're not from here," he said. "Not a question." "St. Louis," she told him. "I am going to Caldwell Creek. My brother has a ranch there." Something shifted in his expression too quickly for her to name. "Caldwell Creek," he repeated. "You know it." A pause. "I know of it." She filed that away in the careful mental cabinet she kept for things that did not quite add up and asked, "What business brings you through this particular stretch of empty desert, Mr. Redmond?" "Passing through," he said. "Passing through to where?" "Not sure yet." She looked at him sidelong, the dust-colored coat, the rifle, the horse that was lean but well cared for, the hands that were calloused in specific ways that told her he had spent years doing hard physical work. There was a quality of solitude about him that went deeper than preference. It had the texture of something chosen under pressure, a man who had learned to carry himself alone because the alternatives had proven dangerous. "You are a drifter," she said. He did not flinch or deflect. "That's one word for it. What is another word for it?" He thought about this with what appeared to be genuine consideration. "Free," he said finally. Then, very quietly, as if correcting himself, "or trying to be." They reached Mesquite Wells as the afternoon was beginning to tip toward evening. The trading post was exactly what the name promised, a cluster of rough buildings around a well, and a struggling stand of mesquite trees, with a small corrals, a stable, and a tavern that served as the social center for every cowhand, prospector, and passing traveler within 40 miles. Henrietta secured the last available private room, a bare but clean space above the trading post, and was descending the stairs to arrange for supper when she heard the voices. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, because what she heard was her own brother's name. Two men at the bar, not bothering to keep their voices especially low because the tavern was noisy and they clearly did not expect to be overheard. One was a narrow, ferret-faced man in a gray vest. The other was built like a barn door, broad and solid with a scarred left hand. "Kendrick's going to sign it by the end of the week," the ferret-faced one said. Daw has him cornered. What about the sister? He said she was coming in. Daw will handle her. She finds out what's in that contract, there'll be trouble. Woman's got a reputation for trouble. A small, fierce burst of satisfaction bloomed in Henrietta's chest at being described as trouble, followed immediately by cold fear for her brother. She pressed back into the shadows of the stairwell and listened. What she heard confirmed the worst of her suspicions. Franklin Daw, the land acquisition man from the stage, was not simply in business with Thomas. He was maneuvering Thomas into a fraudulent sale of the ranch. The Caldwell Creek Land and Trust Company, which was Daw's operation, had been buying up drought-distressed ranches throughout the territory using contracts that buried predatory terms in legal language most ranchers could not parse. Thomas, who was a good man with cattle but had never been strong with documents, had apparently already agreed in principle to terms he did not fully understand. And if Henrietta reached Caldwell Creek and explained those terms to her brother, the deal would collapse. She went back up the stairs very quietly, sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and thought carefully. She needed to reach Thomas before he signed. That meant she needed to reach Caldwell Creek faster than the stage line would take her, and she needed to do it without Dawn knowing her movements. She also needed help. The only person she had met in the last 12 hours who she trusted even marginally was a drifter with no fixed destination who had walked 9 miles through desert heat beside her without once making her feel unsafe, which was, she was well aware, an extremely thin basis for trust. But it was what she had. She found Jedediah Redmond at a table in the corner of the tavern, eating alone, his back to the wall in the way of a man accustomed to watching doors. She sat down across from him without being invited and laid her hands flat on the table and said, without preamble, "I need to reach Caldwell Creek quickly and quietly, and I believe you know this country. I am willing to pay you for your time and your knowledge, but I need to know first whether you have any connection to a man named Franklin Daw or to the Caldwell Creek Land and Trust Company." He had stopped eating when she sat down. He looked at her for a long moment, and that thing she could never quite name moved through his eyes. "I don't work for Daw," he said. "I don't work for anyone. But you know who he is." He was quiet for 3 seconds. "I know what he is." "Then you know he is dangerous." "Yes. And you know what he does to people who get in his way." "Miss Kendrick," his voice was careful, deliberate. "You should get on the next stage to Tucson and go back to St. Louis. Whatever's happening with your brother, there are lawyers, there is no time for lawyers," she said. "And I would appreciate it if you would speak to me as though I am an adult with the capacity to assess my own situation, which I am." Something in his expression shifted. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a quality he understood. "I'll get you to Caldwell Creek," he said. They left Mesquite Wells before dawn on borrowed horses. Jedediah had arranged with the Trading Post stable man to loan them a second mount, a steady old roan, for a fair price, and by mid-morning of the second day, they were well into the hill country that lay between the Trading Post and Caldwell Creek. Jedediah rode with the particular alert economy of someone who had spent years reading landscapes for danger. He watched the ridgelines. He avoided obvious trails when there were alternatives. He knew where water was, found it twice in places that looked, to Henrietta's eyes, like nothing but rock and scrub and futility. She found herself watching him more than she meant to. He was not handsome in any conventional sense. His face was too angular, too weathered, too marked by years of sun and wind, and whatever hard history had brought him to this particular piece of open country with no destination and no ties. But there was a quality in his face, a kind of fierce, concentrated honesty, that she found herself returning to again and again. On the afternoon of the second day, when they stopped at a shallow creek to water the horses, she said, "How old are you?" He looked at her with mild surprise, as if he had not expected the question. 31. She was 27. She had a sharp mind, a deep stubbornness, a modest inheritance from her father that she managed carefully, and a history of prioritizing other people's needs over her own happiness in ways she was only beginning in recent years to examine critically. "What were you before you were a drifter?" she asked. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, rancher for a while. And before that, Texas Ranger. Another pause. For a while. She turned to look at him fully. A Texas Ranger. She thought about the way he moved, the way he watched, the way he had taken stock of the two men at the Mesquite Wells bar without appearing to notice them, and thought, yes. That fits. What happened? She asked. He crouched at the creek's edge, cupped water in his hands, drank. He did not look at her. There was a man I was tracking. He was bad. He'd done things that needed answering for. I found him. He paused. The law's version of justice and my version turned out to be different. What happened to the man? He's in prison, federal prison in Santa Fe, has been for 4 years. Then justice was served. My captain didn't see it that way. The way I got the evidence, the way I operated wasn't according to procedure. I was asked to resign. He stood up, brushed water from his hands. I did. She thought about this. And the ranching. After the Rangers, I went back to a piece of land I had in West Texas, tried to make something of it. The muscles along his jaw tightened. A company came in, bought up the neighboring land, then used legal pressure and some other pressure to make mine untenable. He looked out at the creek with flat, controlled eyes. Sound familiar? It did. It sounded achingly, frighteningly familiar. What company? She asked, though some part of her already knew. Caldwell Creek Land and Trust, he said. The name fell between them like a stone dropped in still water, and the ripples spread out in every direction. Daw ruined you, she said. Daw's operation. He might not have done it personally. His voice was very controlled. But the result was the same. I lost the land. I've been moving ever since. And now you are heading toward Caldwell Creek. He looked at her then, and she understood that the truth was layered, that there were more layers still to go. I have unfinished business, he said carefully. What kind of unfinished business? He was quiet for a long moment. The creek ran past them, unhurried and indifferent. A hawk circled somewhere overhead. The horses drank. I have evidence, Jedediah said finally. Documents I have been collecting for 2 years. The kind that could bring Daw's whole operation down. Contracts he has forged, deeds he has manipulated, men he has bribed and intimidated. I have been building a case. He paused. There is a federal territorial judge in Caldwell Creek who owes me a debt of honor. If I can get those documents into his hands, along with testimony about what has been done to me, to your brother, to a dozen other families, Daw goes to prison and his operation ends. Henrietta was quiet for a moment, organizing this information, feeling the shape of it. And you were making your way to Caldwell Creek already. Yes. And you stumbled across me on a desert trail and walked 9 miles beside me and offered to guide me to the same place you were already going. Yes. Why didn't you tell me this immediately? He looked at her. Because I didn't know you. Because I didn't know if you were connected to Daw. Because knowing too much about what I carry makes people dangerous to themselves. He paused. And because I had already decided I would get you there safely, and adding complications seemed unnecessary. She stood very still, processing this, and then she did something that surprised them both. She laughed. Not bitterly, not hysterically, but with genuine, bright, surprised amusement at the sheer, intricate, almost comical coincidence of it all. We are going to the same place for the same reason, she said. And we spent 2 days dancing around it. The corner of his mouth moved. The dancing seemed prudent. It was entirely prudent, she agreed. And now we stopped dancing. He nodded once, and something between them settled, not into comfort exactly, but into something cleaner and more honest than what had come before. They rode for another 2 hours before he spoke again. Your brother, he said, Thomas Kendrick, he's a good man. He is an excellent man, she said, and meant it completely. He is kind and hardworking, and he loves his wife and his land and his cattle. He is not a shrewd businessman, and he has always been too trusting, and Daw would have identified that about him in the first 5 minutes. Her voice went quieter. He does not deserve what is being done to him. No, Jedediah said. He doesn't. And there was something in the way he said it, a quiet fury, tightly governed, that told her his feeling on the matter was not abstract. It was personal. It was the specific, bone-deep anger of a man who had seen the same thing happen and had been powerless to stop it from happening to himself. "We will stop it from happening to him," she said. He looked at her. "We will," she said again, more firmly. After another moment, he nodded. They made camp that night in a shallow arroyo that offered shelter from the wind and good sight lines in all directions, choices Jedediah made automatically, explaining them in brief practical terms as he made them, in the way of someone who had always known this knowledge, but rarely had anyone to share it with. He showed her how to read the rock walls for overnight temperature, how to position a bedroll to avoid the spots where cold air pooled after midnight. She listened carefully to everything and stored it all. He kept watch while she slept, and she woke in the gray pre-dawn to find him sitting against the arroyo wall with his rifle across his knees and his hat over his face, utterly still, but she instinctively understood not truly asleep. The kind of alert stillness she was beginning to recognize as his particular way of occupying the world. She made coffee over a very small fire, and when she handed him the tin cup their fingers touched briefly, and neither of them said anything about it, but she felt it as a small, quiet explosion somewhere in the center of her chest. The third day brought the first real danger. They were crossing the long saddle of a hill range that Jedediah said would shave 4 hours off the journey when he pulled up suddenly and held a hand out in a flat, stay-still gesture. She stopped her horse immediately and went very quiet. He was watching the eastern ridge. "2 riders," he said, very low. "Been pacing us for about a mile." She looked but could see nothing. "How do you know?" "Dust, and the way the birds moved 3 times." He turned the horses carefully back into a rocky draw that offered cover, and they waited. After 15 minutes, the 2 riders appeared on the ridge, picked their way down toward the trail below, and crossed it without pausing, continuing north. "Not ours?" she asked. "Not today." His voice was flat. "But they were Dawes' men. I've seen the bigger one before in Douglas. He's a hired hand named Carver." He looked at her. "Daw knows you're trying to reach your brother. He must have had men watching the trails from Mesquite Wells." The cold she felt then was not from the wind. "Then he knows about you too." "He might, or he might just be tracking you." A pause. "Either way, we need to move faster." They pushed harder that afternoon, choosing more difficult terrain that was less easily watched, and when they stopped to rest the horses at a limestone spring in late afternoon, Jedediah sat down beside her on a flat rock and said, without preamble, "There's something I haven't told you." She looked at him steadily and waited. "The reason my captain asked me to resign, I told you it was about procedure. That wasn't completely wrong, but it wasn't the whole truth." He looked down at his hands. "The man I was tracking, the man who went to federal prison in Santa Fe, his name is Cole Ashby. He is Franklin Dawes' brother-in-law." Henrietta felt the air shift around this information. "Daw has wanted me specifically since then," Jedediah said. "Not just as an inconvenient obstacle to his business operations, personally. Cole Ashby is in prison because of evidence I gathered and testimony I gave, and Daw holds that against me in a way that goes beyond business." He looked up at her. "There are bounty notices, in the last year or so, posted in towns through this territory. They claim I am wanted for assault. It's fabricated, but it's effective. It makes me someone that sheriffs look at sideways, and it gives Dawes' men a legal-looking reason to take me if they catch me." She remembered the bounty poster she would see in the Caldwell Creek saloon 3 days later. This conversation made sudden, terrible sense of that moment. But right now, in this afternoon sunlight beside this spring, she was looking at the barely visible tightness around his eyes and thinking about what it meant to have been honest and right and to have been punished for it. "You are not wanted for anything genuine," she said. It was not a question. "No," he said. "Then the only thing we need to do is get those documents to Judge Harwell before Dawes' men stop us." "Judge Harwell," he said. "You know him. He has known my family since I was a girl. He and my father were friends." Something connected in her mind. "He is the judge who owes you a debt of honor." "He's the man who actually prosecuted Cole Ashby," Jedediah said. "He knows the full story. He knows the bounty notices are fraudulent, and he's been waiting 2 years for me to bring him something solid enough to move against Daw directly. A pause. I trust him. So do I, she said. Then we have everything we need. We have the documents, we have testimony, we have a judge we both trust. She looked at him fully and felt something fierce and clear rise in her chest. We are going to end this. And on the third night, camped under a sky blazing with stars so thick and bright they looked like split light, something changed between them that had been building since the desert trail outside Tucson. He had been teaching her the stars, identifying them in the unself-conscious way of a man who had spent hundreds of nights under open sky, and she had been lying on her back on her bedroll looking up. And at some point, his voice had stopped, and she had looked over and found him looking at her. Not the way men looked at her, sometimes calculating, or flattering in ways designed to secure something. The way he looked at her was direct and quiet and completely without agenda, and it struck her as the most unexpectedly intimate thing she had ever experienced. This man's honest, unguarded gaze, and she felt her heart turn over in her chest like a slow, warm wave. "What?" she asked softly. "Nothing," he said. Then, after a moment, "You are remarkable." It was not a smooth line. It had the quality of a statement wrenched out against considerable internal resistance, said because it was true, and he apparently had no practice disguising truth. She felt warmth spread through her from the center outward. "You are not nothing yourself," she said. He looked away, but the corner of his mouth moved in that way she had begun to love, the almost smile that was more honest than most people's full grins. She did not sleep easily that night, but for the first time in days, the thoughts keeping her awake were not about danger. The fourth day brought them to within 10 miles of Caldwell Creek. Jedediah knew these last miles well. He had researched this approach, had planned his arrival for weeks, and he led them along a dry streambed that allowed approach from the south, away from the main road where Dawes' men would expect travelers. They were 3 miles from town when the ambush came. It was well placed. 2 riflemen in the rocks above the streambed, a third man blocking the trail ahead on horseback. They came out of concealment fast, and there was no time for the kind of cool assessment that desert survival usually allowed. Jedediah reacted in the space of a breath, pulling his horse hard sideways, shouting at Henrietta to go left, and the streambed filled with the sharp crack of rifle fire. The shots were high warning shots. Henrietta understood with cold clarity, not meant to kill, meant to stop and capture. They wanted Jedediah alive, or at least they wanted the documents he carried. What happened in the next 2 minutes was fast and brutal, and largely beyond Henrietta's ability to influence. And it taught her something about what Jedediah Redmond was capable of under pressure. He went from stillness to motion without apparent intermediate stage, driving his horse directly at the blocking rider, unhorsing the man in a collision that looked almost casual in its violence, grabbing the man's rifle as he fell, using it to draw the attention of the Ridge riflemen while Henrietta got her horse behind a boulder that offered cover. The riflemen broke position and retreated. It happened fast. One of them, apparently deciding the exchange was becoming more costly than the assignment warranted, and the unhorsed man scrambled away on foot, leaving his horse, and within 3 desperate minutes the streambed was quiet again, except that Jedediah's bay mare had been struck, not by a bullet, by a fall in the scrambling chaos, a wrong step on loose rock that had wrenched her right foreleg badly. She was standing with that leg lifted, and when Jedediah dismounted and ran his hands down the leg, his expression told the whole story. "She can't be ridden," he said. Henrietta looked at him. She looked at the horse. She looked at the one unhurt horse remaining, the old roan they had been sharing, and the abandoned horse of the man Jedediah had unhorsed, which had fled when the fighting started. "So there is one horse," she said. "Yes. 3 miles to Caldwell Creek." The sun was falling. Dawes' men had just been repelled but not eliminated. They would regroup, possibly bring more. If the documents did not reach Judge Harwell tonight, there was every chance that Thomas would sign the contract in the morning. not knowing that his signature was the final act in Dawes' trap. Jedediah looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, and also beneath the calculation, something else, something harder to name. He took the roan's reins and walked to her side. "Take it," he said. "You need to get home safely." And she was back in the moment where the story had begun, holding the reins of the only horse while the man who had given her his last protection stepped back into the dying light of an Arizona evening, alone and without a mount, with at least one group of armed men somewhere behind them who would find him again before morning. "No," she said. "That is not acceptable. Henrietta." "Tell me the whole story," she said, "starting with why you think sending me away solves anything. Because if I ride into Caldwell Creek alone with those documents, I do not know where Judge Harwell's house is. I do not know what I am handing him or how to explain it. I do not know the terms of the debt of honor between you, or why he will trust this information from a woman he hasn't seen in 3 years rather than from you directly." She heard her own voice go steadier and more forceful with each sentence. "You need to be in that room, Jedediah, not me, not instead of me, both of us." He was very quiet. The stars were coming out. "I can make 3 miles on foot," he said. "Not in the dark, not with men who might be circling back, and not in time." She looked at the horse and then at him. "We ride together. The horse can carry 2 for 3 miles. She has done it before today. You know that for certain. I know nothing for certain. I am choosing to believe it because the alternative is leaving you here." She met his gaze and held it, and something passed between them in the silence, not just strategy, not just pragmatism, but the full weight of what these 4 days had built between them, layer by careful layer, honesty stacked on honesty, trust earned rather than assumed. "I am not leaving you here." He looked at her for 3 long seconds, and then something in the rigid lines of his posture shifted, very slightly, the way rock shifts when the thing holding it in place finally moves. He took the rein back from her and swung up onto the horse and held down his hand for her. She took it. They rode the last 3 miles into Caldwell Creek with her seated behind him on the roan, her arms around his waist, her face near his shoulder, the stars enormous overhead and the distant lights of town growing slowly larger, and she could feel his heartbeat through his coat and his back, and she thought, "I will remember this. I will remember exactly this for the rest of my life." Caldwell Creek in 1882 was a working cattle town of perhaps 800 souls, organized around a main street of commercial buildings flanked by residential streets that spread out into larger lots as you moved away from the center. Judge Harwell lived in a solid 2-story house on the north end of town, and Jedediah knew exactly where it was. They arrived at the judge's door at 9:15 in the evening. Henrietta knocked. A lamp moved behind a curtained window, and then the door opened, and Judge Matthias Harwell stood in the doorway in his housecoat, with reading spectacles pushed up on his forehead, and a look of profound surprise on his broad, bearded face. He took one look at Jedediah and said, "Redmond, you finally made it." "I have the documents," Jedediah said, "all of them, and a witness." Harwell's eyes moved to Henrietta. His expression shifted: recognition, surprise, warmth. "Henrietta Kendrick, you look exactly like your father." "Judge Harwell," she said, "my brother needs your help tonight." They were inside for 2 hours. Jedediah spread the documents on Harwell's study desk, dozens of pages, carefully organized, some original, some carefully made copies, and walked the judge through them in systematic detail. Henrietta added what she had overheard at Mesquite Wells and what she knew of Thomas's situation. Harwell read and questioned and made notes with the focused precision of a man who had spent 30 years in territorial law. At the end of 2 hours, Harwell leaned back in his chair, took off his spectacles, and said, "This is enough. This is more than enough." He paused. "The fraudulent bounty notices are also here, I see. Redmond, I want you to know that I have been aware for 8 months that those documents were fabricated. I have been building a parallel case. This consolidates everything." He looked at them both. "I can have Dawes' operation frozen by tomorrow morning and warrants issued by the end of the week." Henrietta felt the tension she had been carrying for 4 days begin very slowly to release. "Thomas," she said, "the signing. I will send a deputy to the Kendrick Ranch first thing tomorrow morning to inform your brother formally that the contract he is being asked to sign is under judicial review and that he should take no action until the review is complete." Harwell leaned forward again. "He won't sign, not Thomas. He's stubborn when he needs to be." A small, warm smile, like his sister. She laughed, and it was the release of something enormous. Jedediah had been standing through all of this with contained, careful stillness, and now Harwell looked at him directly and said, "The charges against you, fabricated as they are, will take a few days to officially clear. Until then you should stay somewhere safe and quiet." He paused. "You could stay at the Kendrick Ranch, unless that would be completely acceptable," Henrietta said. She looked at Jedediah. "If you are willing." He looked back at her, and that almost smile appeared. "I'm not sure I have a strong argument against it." They rode to the Kendrick Ranch in borrowed lamplight, and Henrietta's reunion with her brother Thomas was exactly what such reunions are when the threat behind them has just been lifted, deeply relieved, slightly tearful, full of talking over each other, and questions and explanations given twice. Thomas was a rangy, sun-browned man in his late 30s with kind eyes and his sister's same fierce directness. And his wife Ruth was small and quiet, and offered food immediately in the universal language of frontier hospitality. Jedediah stood back during this reunion, as was his nature, accepted the food Ruth pressed on him with quiet thanks, and answered Thomas's careful questions about the road and the ambush in brief, factual terms. But Henrietta watched the way Thomas looked at him, assessing, grateful, slowly warming, and the way Jedediah absorbed that warmth without quite knowing what to do with it, as if genuine welcome was a thing he had not encountered recently and was uncertain how to receive. The next 3 days were extraordinary in the particular way that days are extraordinary when external danger drops away and leaves space for something else to grow. Jedediah stayed. He said it was practical, the warrants, the legal process, the need to be available for testimony, and all of that was true. But Henrietta saw the other truth in the way he woke early and helped Thomas with the morning work without being asked, the way he carried himself in the barn, and the corrals with the ease of someone who genuinely loved this kind of labor, the way he looked at the ranch's rolling pastures in the early morning light with something that was unmistakably longing. She found him on the second morning, sitting on the fence of the main corral, watching Thomas's horses move in the early light. She climbed up beside him and sat on the fence rail, and they were quiet together for a while in the comfortable way they had developed on the trail. "You miss it," she said, "having land." He was quiet for a moment. "I miss the feeling of a place that's yours," he said. "The way a horse knows its home when it crosses its own threshold, the weight of something permanent. You could have that again." He looked at her. "Things tend to follow me," he said carefully. "The kind of things that make permanence complicated. Things that will follow you significantly less once Dawes' operation is dissolved and the fraudulent bounty notices are officially cleared." She paused. "Which is what Judge Harwell told you will happen by the end of the week." "That's true," he said. "Then what argument remains?" He was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, not evasion, but the silence of a man working carefully through something that mattered. "I've been moving for 4 years," he said. "I'm not sure I remember how to stay." "I suspect," she said, "that staying is rather like staying. You simply do it, and after a while it becomes natural." He turned to look at her fully, and there was something in his expression, something open and unguarded, and a little frightened in the way that genuine hope is frightening, that made her heart ache with tenderness. "Why did you not let me give you that horse and ride away?" he asked. "It would have been safer for you." "I was not interested in the option that required leaving you behind," she said simply. The silence that followed this was warm and complete, and then he did something she had not expected. He reached over and took her hand on the fence rail and held it, his thumb moving once across her knuckles, and said nothing. And she leaned her shoulder very slightly against his, and they sat that way, as the sun came up over the Superstition Mountains, and the horses moved below them in the golden light. On the fourth morning, Franklin Daw was arrested at the hotel in Caldwell Creek, where he had been staying in comfortable confidence that his operation was secure. He did not go quietly, but he went. The deputy who brought him in reported that, when shown the judicial order and the list of charges, Daw had gone a particular shade of gray that was deeply satisfying to witness. Henrietta heard this news from Thomas at breakfast and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for longer than the 4 days of this crisis. As long, perhaps, as the month she had been worrying from St. Louis about her brother's letters. She walked out onto the porch with her coffee, and Jedediah appeared around the corner of the house from the direction of the barn, dusting his hands on his trousers, and she said, "Daw is arrested." And he stopped walking and stood very still for a moment, and she watched the 4 years of being hunted and dispossessed and forced into solitude register on his face, and then slowly, quietly, like ice going out of a river in the spring, release. He let out a long, slow breath. She walked down the porch steps to him and handed him her coffee, and he took it without speaking, and they stood together in the morning sunshine, and there was nothing left between them that was unspoken or withheld, and the silence was full and warm and completely without fear. "What will you do now?" she asked. He looked at the mountains. He looked at the ranch. He looked at her. "That," he said carefully, "depends on several things." "What things?" He looked at her for a long moment, and then he set the coffee down on the porch rail and turned to face her fully, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it, completely stripped of the careful guardedness he had worn since the day they met. "I am going to say something," he said, "and I want you to understand that I am aware it is too soon, and I am aware that I am not a man with much to offer in the conventional sense, and I am aware that you have a life in St. Louis and a family and obligations that have nothing to do with—" He stopped, tried again. "I do not want to go back to drifting. I want to stay in one place. I want to stay in a place where you are." He paused. "That is the thing I want. I am telling you so that you know, and so that whatever happens next happens clearly." She felt something enormous and warm turn over in her chest, like the sun coming out after a long cloud. "That is the least eloquent declaration I have ever heard," she said, his jaw tight. "I know. And also," she said, "the most honest." He held her gaze. "I do not want to go back to St. Louis," she said. "I have been thinking about this since the second day on the trail, and I want you to know that my conclusions have nothing to do with 4 days of shared danger, making things feel more significant than they are. I have been aware of who you are since you offered to walk 9 miles through desert heat beside a stranger without requiring anything in return. And I have been," she paused, "choosing honesty over caution, falling in love with you since approximately the moment you told me you had left the Rangers because your version of justice and the official version were different." He was very still. "Because that told me," she continued, "that you were a man who acted from genuine conviction rather than institutional permission, and I find that I cannot resist a man like that. I never have been able to." "Henrietta," he said, and her name in his mouth was a completely different thing than it was in anyone else's. "Jedediah," she said back and smiled, and he crossed the 3 feet between them and took her face in his hands and kissed her with the same direct, unhurried honesty that was the entire foundation of his character, and she kissed him back with everything she had been carrying and had not yet had room to put down. Thomas, appearing in the doorway of the ranch house at this particular moment to ask about breakfast, took in the scene with admirable calm, went back inside, and could be heard asking Ruth whether there were enough eggs. Ruth, who had seen it coming since dinner on the first night, said that there were absolutely enough eggs and put more coffee on. The warrants were fully processed within the week, exactly as Harwell had promised. Jedediah testified before the territorial court in a proceeding that lasted 2 days and addressed not only the Kendrick situation, but a pattern of fraudulent land acquisition that stretched across 4 counties. 3 other families came forward with testimony once Daw was in custody, and the power of his operation was visibly broken. Franklin Daw was convicted on 6 counts of fraud, land theft, and conspiracy to defraud, and sentenced to 12 years in the federal penitentiary in Detroit, Michigan. His company was dissolved by court order, and the land it had illegally acquired, including Jedediah's former property in West Texas, was ordered returned or compensated. The fraudulent bounty notices were formally and officially declared forgeries and expunged from every territorial record in which they appeared. Judge Harwell handled this personally, and with what Henrietta suspected was particular satisfaction. When Jedediah walked out of the courthouse on the last day of the proceedings, Henrietta was waiting on the steps. He looked lighter. Not dramatically. He was not a dramatic man, not in his body or his bearing, but there was something gone from around his eyes that had been there since the first moment she met him, some permanent watchful tightness that had been the accumulated weight of 4 years of being hunted and dispossessed. He came down the steps and stopped in front of her and said, "It's done." "It's done," she agreed, "all of it, all of it." He was quiet for a moment looking at her, and then he said, with the same stripped-down directness he had brought to everything that mattered between them, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that the asking is permanent on my part. This is not a circumstantial question." "Ask," she said. "Will you marry me?" Not a flourish, not a performance. 4 words, direct and absolute, and carrying the full weight of a man who had spent 4 years with nothing permanent, and had found, in 4 improbable days on a desert trail, something he wanted to keep for the rest of his life. She looked at him and felt the world settle around her into a shape that fit. "Yes," she said. "On the condition that we stay in Arizona territory, because I find I have become attached to the mountains." "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. Thomas, who had been standing near enough to hear because he was Thomas and could not help himself, let out a whoop that startled a horse hitched to the rail across the street, and Ruth, who had also been near enough to hear because she and Thomas operated as a unit in most things, covered her mouth with both hands and had eyes that were bright with very happy tears. They were married in Caldwell Creek 6 weeks later, in the small church on the north end of town, on a Saturday in late October when the air had the first edge of autumn cool, and the cottonwood trees along the creek had turned a brilliant, burning yellow. Henrietta wore her best traveling dress, which was dark green silk, because she had not brought anything more formal to Arizona and had no patience for ordering from a catalog when the green silk was perfectly good. Jedediah wore a clean dark coat and his second-best hat, and looked so well in both that Thomas confided later to Ruth that he had not fully expected the drifter to clean up that well, and Ruth told him that any woman could have seen it coming. Judge Harwell performed the ceremony. His voice had the deep, carrying quality of a man accustomed to formal proceedings, and when he arrived at the part about forsaking all others and keeping only unto this person for as long as you both shall live, he looked at Jedediah with the particular look of a judge who knew the full history of the man before him, and Jedediah looked back at him steadily, and then looked at Henrietta, and said "I will" in the same voice he used for everything that was permanently true. After the ceremony, there was a celebration at the ranch that included most of the town, because Thomas Kendrick's neighbors had been watching the developments of the past 6 weeks with considerable interest, and there was widespread goodwill toward the woman and the man who had brought Daw's predatory operation to an end and given a dozen families back their peace of mind. There was dancing, and a fiddle player from a ranch 10 miles east who was genuinely skilled, and tables set up in the yard with food that Ruth and the neighboring women had produced in quantities that defied reasonable explanation. The night was clear and the stars were extraordinary, and Jedediah danced with his wife 3 times, which was 3 times more than anyone who knew him would have predicted, and each time he danced with her, he held her with the same quality of careful attention he brought to everything that mattered. They built a house on a plot of land west of Thomas's ranch, on a piece of ground that Henrietta had chosen after careful evaluation, because it had a good well, a natural windbreak of old mesquite trees on the north side, and a view of the mountains that she was, as she had told Jedediah, entirely unwilling to sacrifice. The land was purchased fair and square, and the deed was properly registered with the county. And when Jedediah came home after the first ride around their property to check fences, he came back with the particular expression she had come to associate with him when something had gone deeper than his surface, and reached the place where the things he truly cared about lived quiet, concentrated, looking at something beyond the immediate sight line. She was waiting on the porch they had not finished building yet, sitting on a crate with her coffee. "How is the land?" she asked. "Good," he said. He stepped down from the horse and looked around at the mesquite trees and the distant mountains. "Really good." "Yours," she said. He looked at her. "Ours," he said. She felt something in her chest that was the specific warmth of a happiness that has been earned rather than simply received, the particular pleasure of things arrived at through fire and open country and considerable honesty. "Ours," she agreed. The first winter on the property was hard in the useful way that first winters on new land are hard, not disastrous, but demanding. There were things to build and repair, systems to establish, decisions to make about stock and water, and the 100 practical considerations that frontier ranching required. Jedediah was in his element in a way that was beautiful to witness. His years of drifting had, it turned out, been years of involuntary education, and he had learned things in each place he had passed through that applied now in specific and practical ways. He knew how to read the land for the best placement of a windmill. He knew which plants near the creek edge indicated good underground water. He knew how to talk to horses that had learned to distrust people, which was a skill that proved broadly applicable. Henrietta ran the household accounts with the focused precision she brought to everything financial, identified 2 commercial opportunities for selling produce that Thomas had missed, negotiated a supply arrangement with the Mesquite Wells trading post that benefited both parties, and in between these activities finished reading 3 novels and started writing letters to a women's educational organization in Tucson that was trying to establish a school in Caldwell Creek. They were not, either of them, people who were content with only what was immediate. They were people who reached. In the late spring, Henrietta confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks. She was expecting their first child. She told Jedediah in the evening, sitting on the finished porch with the mountains going purple in the sunset. She said it simply and directly, the way she said everything that mattered, watching his face. He was still for 3 long seconds, and then something moved through his face that was not the controlled guardedness she had first encountered, but its complete opposite, something open and undone and full, something that had the quality of a man being surprised by the full size of what he had been given. He said her name. Then he pulled her close with both arms and held her, and she could feel against her cheek the particular pattern of his heartbeat, which she knew as well by this point as any landscape she had ever lived in. "A boy or a girl," he said into her hair. "I have no means of knowing that before the fact," she said, "and anyone who tells you they do is speculating." She felt him laugh, really laugh, full and deep, and she smiled against his shoulder and thought, this is the exact right thing. Their son was born in November, on a night when the wind was sharp, and Judge Harwell, who had taken to making the ride to their ranch for Sunday dinner with the comfortable regularity of family, happened to be present because of a prior arrangement, and found himself, somewhat to his surprise, the 3rd adult in the room when the doctor could not arrive in time. He acquitted himself well. Henrietta acquitted herself superbly. Jedediah held her hand through the whole of it with the same steadiness he had held his rifle in the arroyo, and when the child arrived squalling, emphatic, announcing itself with considerable energy, the look on Jedediah's face when he first held his son was something that Harwell, who was a man of considerable composure, had to look away from for a moment because it was too much like looking at something sacred. They named the boy Matthias Samuel Redmond. Matthias for Judge Harwell, who pretended not to be moved by this and was entirely moved. Samuel for Jedediah's father, who had been a man he had loved and lost to a fever when Jedediah was 19. Matthias Redmond was, from the first week of his existence, a person of strong opinions and considerable volume, both of which he appeared to have inherited from his mother, and a fundamental physical fearlessness and patience that were unmistakably his father's. He was a delight and a disruption, and both his parents were thoroughly besotted with him. Thomas and Ruth had a daughter the following spring, and the two babies grew up with the comfortable, unconscious closeness of children raised on neighboring land, aware of each other before they were aware of much else. The school that Henrietta had been writing letters about was established in Caldwell Creek in 1884, with a formal building and a trained teacher from Tucson. Henrietta served on its founding committee with the same focused determination she brought to everything she believed in, and when the teacher's first assistant position opened, she recommended a young woman from a neighboring ranch who had shown considerable aptitude and no conventional opportunities, and was satisfied by the result. Jedediah became, without quite planning to, a man who was trusted by his community in practical ways, sought out for his knowledge of livestock, for his skill at resolving disputes between neighbors about water rights with the calm authority of someone who had no personal stake in the outcome beyond the general welfare of people he cared about. He did not seek prominence. Prominence, finding no resistance, settled on him anyway. In the autumn of 1885, a letter arrived from the federal court in Tucson informing Jedediah that his West Texas property, the land that Dawes Company had illegally forced him to abandon 4 years earlier, had been fully restored by court order and was legally his again. He read the letter twice at the breakfast table, then handed it to Henrietta without comment. She read it. She looked up at him. "What do you want to do about it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Then sell it," he said, "fairly and at a good price to someone who will work it. It is someone else's place now." He paused. "My place is here." She looked at him across the breakfast table, the man who had once been a Texas Ranger, then a man with no fixed location, then a drifter who had ended up on a desert trail walking beside a stranger toward a broken stage axle, and felt the specific texture of a happiness that had been built carefully over years and was solid all the way through. "Yes," she said, "it is." The land was sold. The proceeds were invested in improvements to their Arizona property, and one of those improvements was a new stable large enough for the horses that Jedediah was beginning to breed, not just working stock but quality horses, the kind that combined the endurance of frontier-bred animals with the speed and form of better blood, horses that brought buyers from 3 territories. By 1886, the Redmond Ranch had a reputation, and by 1887, that reputation extended to the Arizona Stockmen's Association, which invited Jedediah to present at their annual meeting in Tucson on the subject of breeding management in arid climates. He accepted, thought about it for 2 days, and then announced that Henrietta would be presenting alongside him because the financial management and record-keeping systems that had made the operation sustainable were hers, and the audience should know that. Henrietta, who had never been to a Stockmen's Association meeting, and who was perfectly aware that women did not typically present at such events in 1887, agreed immediately and with considerable pleasure. They presented together to an audience that had not expected them and was not quite sure what to make of them. And by the end of the presentation, the audience was making a great deal of favorable noise, and 3 ranchers had asked for follow-up meetings. And one older cattleman in the front row had leaned over to his neighbor and said something that both men laughed at. And Jedediah had given the older cattleman a look of such flat, steady regard that the laughing stopped immediately. On the train back from Tucson, Henrietta was reading. She was always reading, and Jedediah was watching the desert go by in the way he had watched it on that first trail together, with the same attentive alertness but carrying now, she could see, none of the old guarded wariness, just attention, just genuine interest in the world he was moving through. "What are you thinking?" she asked, looking up from her book. He turned from the window. "I was thinking about that first day," he said. "The trail from the broken stage. You were carrying a parasol," she laughed. "It was doing nothing." "It was doing absolutely nothing," he agreed. "But you were carrying it anyway because you had brought it and you were going to use it. That is an accurate summary of my general approach to most things." "I know," he said, and looked at her the way he had looked at her on that third night under the stars, direct, honest, without agenda, except that now there was 4 years of shared life behind it, 4 years of mornings and difficult seasons, and a son who had his father's eyes and his mother's determination, and the look carried all of that like a river carrying everything it had ever touched. "I knew that day," he said. "Somewhere in the first hour of walking beside you, I knew you were going to change everything." "Everything needed changing," she said. "Yes," he said. "It did." She reached over and took his hand, and he turned it over and held hers with the same solid, unhurried grip he had offered on the corral fence on that first morning at the ranch, and they rode south through the Arizona afternoon in comfortable silence, with the desert goldenrod around them and the mountains rising in the distance and everything they had built waiting for them on the other side. Matthias was 4 by this time and had recently discovered that horses were the best thing in the world, and that his father would teach him anything he asked about them with unlimited patience. He spent portions of every day at the corral fence, watching, and Jedediah would lift him up and explain in simple, serious terms what was happening with the animals below, treating his son's attention and interest with the same genuine respect he had always offered Henrietta. She watched them from the house sometimes, father and son at the fence in the morning light, and felt the particular gratitude that comes not from things being easy, but from things having been earned. 2 years after Matthias, in 1886, they had a daughter. They named her Clara Ruth Redmond Ruth for Thomas's wife, who had been a steady and generous friend through every season, and Clara because Henrietta had loved the name since girlhood and saw no reason to defer such a preference any longer. Clara arrived with none of Matthias's emphatic announcing of herself. She was a quiet, watchful baby who looked at the world with huge, serious eyes and appeared to be cataloging information from the first week of life. Jedediah held her with the same complete attention he had held Matthias, but added a gentleness so specific to this small, watching person that Henrietta caught her breath when she first saw it. "She is very alert," Jedediah said, looking at his daughter with considerable wonder. "She is already studying you," Henrietta said. He looked up. "Is that good?" "With you as a subject," she said. "Absolutely." Clara grew into a child who was curious about everything, specifically, the kind of everything that could be found in books and in the natural world in almost equal measure. By the time she was 3, she demanded to be read to for extended periods each day, and had firm opinions about which stories were satisfying and which were not. By the time she was 5, she could read simple texts herself, and was working through Matthias's picture books with focused determination. Matthias, for his part, had grown into a boy who was deeply absorbed by horses and the outdoor world, and was beginning to show the specific quality of patient attentiveness that was his father's most distinctive characteristic. He was 7 when he first helped Jedediah work a young horse from start to saddle, and the way he moved around that animal calm, deliberate, reading the horse's responses with an accuracy that surprised even Jedediah, suggested that whatever life he chose, the outdoor world would be central to it. Thomas's ranch thrived as the drought that had plagued the territory finally broke in 1887 with a winter of good rains. The creek that ran along the eastern boundary of both properties, the Kendrick and Redmond spreads, ran full for the first time in years, and the pastures greened up with a richness that made grown men stand in their fields and feel something close to religious emotion. Judge Harwell retired from the bench in 1888 and moved to Caldwell Creek permanently, into a small house on the north end of town, and his Sunday dinners at the Redmond Ranch became a standing institution that neither side was willing to interrupt for any non-emergency reason. He was 71 years old, sharp-minded and deliberate as ever, and he had taken on the role of grandfather to Matthias and Clara with such naturalness that the children did not question it. It was Harwell who gave Matthias his first book of natural history, a richly illustrated volume from back east, and sat with the boy through the long winter evenings, explaining what the pictures meant and building in him a love of scientific understanding that would, years later, shape the direction of his education. It was Harwell who told Clara, when she was 6, and had read something from the newspaper that confused her about why women could not vote, that she was right to be confused, and that the world had not caught up to the obvious truth yet, but that it would, and that the obligation of people who understood the obvious truth was to keep making it visible. Clara had looked at him with her enormous, serious eyes and said, "Like my mother does," and Harwell had said, "Exactly like your mother," and Henrietta, who had been in the doorway and had heard this entire exchange, had gone quietly back to the kitchen with a full heart. On an evening in the summer of 1888, 6 years after a broken stage axle in the Arizona desert had set everything in motion, Henrietta and Jedediah sat on their finished porch fully roofed, properly railed, hung with a lamp that cast warm yellow light over the yard, in the particular quiet of a house where the children had recently, finally, gone to sleep. The mountains were turning colors in the last of the daylight, the specific sequence she had come to know as precisely as a piece of music purple-gray to rose to deep violet to the first darkness, and the horses moved in the corral below with the sound that she had decided was one of the best sounds she knew. 6 years, she said. 6 years, he confirmed. When you stepped off your horse on that desert trail and offered to walk beside me, what did you expect? He thought about this in the honest way he thought about everything that mattered. I expected to get you to Mesquite Wells and move on, he said. I expected it to be one of those encounters where someone is genuinely in need, and you have the ability to help and you do, and then it's done. A pause. I did not expect any of this. Did any of it happen as you would have planned it? None of it, he said. Not a single piece. He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes she had been reading for 6 years without fully exhausting their depth. I am deeply grateful for that. She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at the mountains and let the evening settle around them in layers, the cooling air, the sounds of the ranch, the distant lamp from Thomas's house visible across the intervening fields, the weight of Jedediah's arm coming around her. "What do you want next?" she asked. It was a question she asked periodically, not from anxiety but from genuine curiosity. He had been a man with no destination once, and she found it consistently interesting to learn what shape his wanting took now that wanting was safe. He was quiet for a long moment, thinking in the careful way he had. "I want Matthias to have what I didn't," he said. "A place that will never be threatened, land that is his fully and permanently and protected by law." A pause. "I want Clara to have every door open that she is capable of walking through, and there will be many of them." Another pause. "I want to breed 3 more horses before winter. I want to fix the east fence line before the rains." He looked at her. "I want Sunday dinner next week to include that soup Ruth made last month because it was extraordinary." A final pause. "And I want to be here," he said, "with you, in this place at this particular moment and all the moments after it." "Those are very good things to want," she said. "You?" He asked. She thought about it honestly. "I want the school to be given a proper library budget next year. I want to write the letter I have been composing in my head to the Territorial Education Authority about the curriculum standards. I want to read 3 more books before the end of summer." She paused. "I want Matthias to grow into the man I already see the outline of, who is your son in every quality that matters. I want Clara to grow into someone who changes things because she will." She paused. "And I want exactly this, exactly what you said, this place, this life you." He pressed his lips to her hair, and she closed her eyes and felt the mountains and the evening and the sound of the horses and the weight of everything they had built together and thought, from a broken stage axle, from a desert trail, from a drifter who walked beside a stranger for 9 miles and handed her the reins of his last horse and said, "Take it, you need to get home safely." She had taken the horse. And she had also, in a very different and much more significant sense, taken everything else: the honesty, the steadiness, the fierce contained love that had been his from almost the beginning, the hard-won piece of a man who had found what permanence felt like and chosen it completely. She had taken it and built a life from it, and the life was good and solid and real, and it was theirs. The lamp on the porch burned yellow in the Arizona evening, and inside the house 2 children slept the deep, easy sleep of children who are loved and safe, and surrounded by something permanent. And outside, the mountains held their ancient shapes against the darkening sky, unchanged by any of the human urgency and hope and love that played out at their feet, witnesses as they had always been to the particular, improbable, durable beauty of people choosing each other. Jedediah Redmond, who had once carried nothing but documents and a dark past, and the accumulated loneliness of a man who had lost everything, sat on his porch on his land beside his wife with his children sleeping behind him, and felt, not the restless alertness of a man with nowhere to be, but the deep, steady, completely unfamiliar and endlessly satisfying weight of a man who had arrived. Henrietta Kendrick Redmond, who had once traveled west with worry and a parasol that was doing nothing, sat beside the man who had changed everything and felt, not the relief of a crisis resolved, but the ongoing, building, deepening warmth of a life that was growing more itself with every passing year. They sat together until the lamp needed tending and the mountain had gone fully dark, and the stars had come out in their full, impossible, generous abundance, the same stars he had named for her on the 3rd night of a journey that had turned into the rest of their lives. She still knew them all.